Commentary for Chapter 2, Industry Competition. Now in this chapter we talk about the concept of industry and the issues surrounding the definition of an industry. We talk about the industry life cycle. We provide a process for analyzing potential profitability in an industry using Porter's 5 forces model. And we close our discussion with the limitation of Porter's model. Now what do we mean when we use the term industry? An industry is a group of companies that produce competing products or services. Now we think about the companies within an industry as primary competitors or close rivals or just rivals. Sometimes newscasters or other pundits will use the word industry to refer to a single company. They'll say something like a new industry is coming to town, and what they really mean is a new company is coming to town. Now sometimes this definition is accepted, but in our context, an industry refers to all of the companies that produce those products or services in a way that they are all competing. Now, rivals often share what we call critical success factors. These are CSFs. These are elements of the strategy that promote but don't guarantee success in a particular industry. So if you follow the CSFs, you're more likely to be successful, but not guaranteed to be successful. Good example of a CSF in the fast food industry would be providing fast service. After all, it's called fast food for a reason. So you would assume that all successful companies in the fast food industry would provide quick service. For the most part, this is true, but not always true. Sometimes you'll see a company specifically tell its customers, when you make an order, we're going to take our time preparing your sandwich hot and fresh, and it's going to be perhaps not so fast food. So it's possible to succeed when you violate some of the CSFs, but it's just not common. Most companies follow the CSFs if they're going to be successful in a particular industry. So how do you define the industry for your company? Well, you can look at some pre-existing industry definitions. One of the common approaches is the old SIC system, or Standard Industrial Classification System. Now this is outdated but still commonly used online. It's a 4-digit system. You might have industry 1, 2, 3, 4, for example. The first digit being the broadest and the fourth being most specific. Now these were created by government essentially, so they're not necessarily the best way to think about the industry for your company. Now the SIC was replaced with the NAICS. This was a NAFTA type project because the NAICS looks at companies in the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. It's again, it's an interesting way to think about the industry, a good starting point, but you should never blindly accept somebody else's definition for your industry. You can use that as fodder for discussion, but you need to think through that clearly. If you don't do this, if you accept somebody else's definition, you're likely to overlook some key sources of competition and maybe include some that should not be included. I can't stress the importance of this enough, because if you don't spend the time to analyze and define your industry correctly from the outset, and if you just accept somebody else's definition, you'll have problems down the road as you do your case analysis. Now, we often use the terms primary and secondary industries to distinguish between what we would consider close and maybe less close or more distant competitors. Again, following fast food as an example, we might consider, for McDonald's, let's say, we might consider Wendy's and Burger King to be primary competitors or part of the primary industry. We might look at other restaurants, perhaps a Mexican restaurant or Pizza Hut, as a secondary competitor or part of the secondary industry. Now, when we talk about McDonald's industry, we're really referring to the primary industry, but that secondary designation allows us to think about a group of companies or rivals that might exist in certain situations but may not be close competitors. So how do we think about our position within an industry? Perhaps the most common way is by thinking about market share. This is the proportion of industry sales that are attributed to a particular rival. So if you say that your company has 8% market share, what you mean is that 8% of all of the sales from the industry as you've defined it can be attributed to your particular company. Now, sometimes if you try to find the information online, you may not find the market share data based on how you've defined your industry, or you might have to pay for it in terms of doing a case analysis. Now, if you're in part of a large company, you have a staff, you have a budget, you can figure this out. But if you're ever doing research on your own, sometimes you have limitations. So instead of computing market share, which can be very difficult, you might look at what we call relative market share. So relative market share is the percentage of revenue that your company provides when you think about the market as being a specific list or limited group of competitors. So again, using the fast food industry as an example, we can think about McDonald's having X% market share in the entire fast food industry, or we could say McDonald's has Y% of relative market share when we only consider, let's say, McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, Wendy's, and Burger King. Again, there are different reasons why you might want to use relative market share, sometimes simply because you can't get the market share data, other times because you want to emphasize your position or the position of your company relative to a subset of competitors. So that can be really useful. Now this brings us to case analysis step number 2. When you're doing a case, you should start the process of defining your industry with what's out there. You can look at SIC or NAICS categorizations, and often, again, considering fast food as a restaurant, that term is thrown around by lots of different pundits. But what does fast food really mean? You need to think through this. Make sure you understand exactly what you mean when you say, this is our industry and this is who's in it. Just citing somebody else is not acceptable. Another way of thinking about this is if you're running a billion-dollar company, are you going to make investments for that company and think long-term based on somebody else's definition of who your competitors are, or on your definition? You really got to nail this down early. Now, if you want a hint at figuring out who's in your industry, ask that question: where would my customers go if my firm did not exist? The answer to that question is typically your industry. Now, you should draw a picture to illustrate the firm's inside and outside the industry. The picture is worth 1,000 words. So you can, let's say if we're following that fast food example, when we're thinking about McDonald's would be in the middle of the diagram, and we'll have some other companies listed in a circle around the companies in our industry. And maybe we show some outside the circle, like a Pizza Hut or a Chinese restaurant that we want to identify as we want to recognize them as being valid restaurants and sometimes providing a form of competition, but we just don't consider them in our industry for a reason. So pictures are nice because they can help describe, provide a description that is more difficult to explain in words. Provide your market shares if possible. So if you can identify the market share of your company and your top competitors, you need to do that. If that information is not available, you need to compute relative market share. So either market share for the entire industry or relative market share should be presented. Now, another concept with the industry is that of the industry life cycle. Now, we can think about an industry as going through multiple stages. Industry start, a company all of a sudden begins to offer products or services that haven't been offered before, and then companies grow. As they grow, you see a lot of new competitors pop in because there's apparently demand for this product or service. You don't have to be great, you just have to have the product in order to be successful. But then you reach a point where some companies get bigger and demand starts to level out, and those that just aren't doing a good job fall by the wayside. And we call this shakeout. Eventually, shakeout becomes maturity, where you have very little new demand for an industry. Maybe the only additional demand is when your product breaks and you have to buy a new one. It's not growing like it used to. At that point, product or production efficiency becomes really important, and you have a lot of additional companies fall. Ultimately, you end up in decline, and that's a point where maybe the product or service you offer is just no longer demanded. A couple of examples here, if you think through in terms of decline, one would be the newspaper industry. A couple of decades ago, people read the newspaper, right, in terms of picking up a print copy and reading it. Today, people get a lot of their news and information online. So if we think about the industry as being newspapers, we would say that that industry has declined and has been in decline for some time. If we think of that industry more broadly as providing news or some type of media industry, then we would say that no, the industry hasn't declined, it's just transitioned from print forms to electronic form. If we also think about introductions, sometimes we don't notice these introductions early on. They just we look historically and can think about them in that respect. Interesting example here would be a company like eBay. Now, eBay essentially connects buyers and sellers in markets that are kind of complicated if you don't have an intermediary like eBay. But when eBay started, there were lots of other auction sites. They tried. Yahoo had one. There are a lot of other companies. If you Google this sometime, you can see some of the old remnants of different auction competitors. But then most of them fell by the wayside with, the exception of some specialized providers like, say, StubHub that sells concert and athletic competition tickets. So you have some specialized auction sites, but as far as a general one, eBay seems to run that industry. So if you go back, you'll see there were a lot of original competitors in that introduction and growth stage, but shakeout occurred, and this industry has matured, and now eBay runs the market. So let's shift our attention to the bulk of the material that's addressed in this chapter, and that being Porter's 5 forces model. So Porter provided a model that allows us to assess potential industry profitability. This doesn't tell us if an industry is profitable. It tells us if it should be based on the structure. And it doesn't tell us that a firm is profitable. Remember, there are differences among firms. We'll get to that a little bit later. Porter's 5-force model should be applied at the industry level. You don't apply it to a company. You don't talk about how your company fares in the 5-force model. So again, this is industry level analysis. Essentially what Porter says is there are 5 structural factors you should consider when thinking about the extent to which your industry would provide profits. The first of these is in the middle, is existing rivalry. How competitive is your industry? The second is barriers to entry at the top. How difficult is it to get in the industry? The third is threat of substitutes down at the bottom. What's offered by companies outside of your industry? These aren't competitors. These are companies outside the industry that might substitute for what you provide. And then finally, the bargaining power of suppliers and buyers. So when you think about companies as a group in the industry and they have to negotiate to get what they need to produce, and then they also sell to customers, who wields the most power here? Is it the power controlled specifically by companies in the industry or by those outside, the suppliers or the buyers? And the answer to these 5 questions gives us a sense of the potential profitability of the industry. So we kind of take a second look, we'll see how that works. If existing rivalry is high, then you would expect the profitability to be low, or potential profitability, because if it's very competitive, that means everyone's fighting in price wars, new products, new services, and that makes it more difficult for individual companies to earn a profit. So high rivalry is great for consumers, but it's not good for companies in the industry. Barriers to entry, if they're high, well, that supports profitability, because that means that if you're making money in the industry, others can't easily come in. Okay? What about threat of substitutes? Well, if there are lots of substitutes, that's not good for industry profitability, because what that means is that individuals or buyers or consumers, whether it's consumer level or not, they can go to other industries to satisfy the needs that they have. And finally, what about the bargaining power of suppliers and buyers? If those are high, then that's not going to be good for profitability, because what that means is that if you're making money, your suppliers will try to extract more from you by raising their prices, and the buyers will ultimately extract more from you by demanding lower prices. So each of these structural factors influences the potential profitability in an industry. Now, just a couple of points to shore up here before we start talking about specifics for each of the forces. These 5 forces determine the potential for profitability. Okay, again, this doesn't mean that if you operate in this industry, your firm will be profitable. it means that there's a potential for profitability. All things equal, it's better not to be paddling upstream. So think in terms of potential profitability as the direction that the stream is flowing, and think about your company as to whether you want to be paddling with the current or against the current. Okay. Ideally, firms should seek to compete in industries with a high potential profitability potential. Again, it promotes success but does not guarantee it. So let's talk about existing rivalry or intensity of rivalry among incumbent firms. Again, this is not a general statement about rivalry. If you ask any executive if his or her industry is competitive, the answer is always, oh yeah, a lot of competition. This is a dog-eat-dog industry. Nah, maybe it is, maybe it's not. There are certain factors we look at. In fact, there are 8 specific issues that we analyze to make a structural determination as to whether rivalry is high or not. The first of these is concentration of competitors. The more competitors you have, the more rivalry there is. If you only have a couple of competitors, often they divide the turf and they don't compete directly. So here you want to see more competitors. Now, one of the ways of measuring this is what's called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, or HHI. And you can look and see how this is calculated. And this is an interesting concept because this measure is often used by government regulators when they consider mergers and other activities as being competitive or non-competitive. Okay, and you can the HHI allows you to think in terms of a number that number might be 4,400 or 6,217, but that number gives you an indication of the extent to which an industry is competitive, or the extent to which you have a lot of rivalry in an industry. Now, the second factor we think of in terms of rivalry is high fixed or storage costs. If you have high fixed or storage costs, then you have an incentive to sell lots of product to cover those fixed costs. Okay, so if you think in terms of say, flying an aircraft, once you buy the plane and the plane has 150 seats, you have an incentive to sell those seats. You don't want to fly the plane with 10 passengers. Okay, that's lost revenue, which means there's an incentive for your company to lower the price on those tickets for the other 140 to try to fill the aircraft. So high fixed or storage costs create incentives for companies to lower prices, and of course when that happens, it takes a bite out of everyone's profitability. What about slow industry growth? If the industry is not growing rapidly, or maybe not growing at all, just perhaps with just inflation, then that means the only way individual companies grow is to take a bite out of somebody else's market share. That's really difficult. It's a lot easier to grow your firm when the entire industry is growing at 30% a year. It's difficult to do when it's growing at 3%. So slow industry growth makes the industry much more competitive and increases rivalry. The fourth factor is the lack of differentiation or low switching costs. Now, differentiation refers to the extent to which products or services are perceived by buyers to be different. The switching costs are the costs that buyers incur when they switch from one competitor to another. Sometimes it's actual outlay, a financial outlay they spend. Sometimes it's not. For example, if you have a cell phone contract and you agree to 2-year service and you break that contract 6 months in, there's a switching cost. You have to pay a fee to get out. Okay. If you have if switching costs are low, that means consumers or buyers relative to an industry can switch whenever they want very easily. It's kind of like going to a different restaurant each day. Very low switching costs, which means that companies have to bring their A game every day in terms of the products and services they provide. If the switching costs are high, then that makes it easier for companies to hold on to existing competitors. So from the perspective of companies inside an industry, you want to see you want to see the switching costs being very high. You want to make it difficult for your customers to change, and then you want to see a lot of differentiation, which means your customers will be more likely to stay with your product instead of trying somebody else's because they think your product is different and better and perhaps worth the additional, maybe a higher price that you charge for it. What about capacity augmented in large increments? If you have to add capacity in a big chunk, then you now have an incentive to use all the capacity. Good example is a hotel. If the hotel's full and I want a room, they can't just create another room. It just doesn't work that way. If the hotel decides to expand, they have to add another wing, another section, another group of rooms. Now they have lots of rooms. They have an incentive to sell them. That means they're likely to cut price. That makes the industry more competitive. What about the diversity of competitors? Now, if you have companies that are diverse in their origins, cultures, or strategies, they have different goals and means of competition. Okay, this makes it difficult for these companies to agree on a set of rules or the way an industry is typically functions. If you think about service stations in the U.S., you drive by, they all tend to sell the same thing, sort of a convenience store setting. You can pay with your credit card to pump gas in your car. They're very close. They post their prices for gasoline the same way on their signs. So they all agree. They all subtly agree in terms of how they should be competing. When you don't have this, then you can have a lot higher rivalry. So, for if you're a company in an industry, then you would like there to be very little diversity. That way you understand the rules, and maybe you stay on your turf and I stay on my turf. Finally, high strategic stakes. Competitive rivalry is likely to be high if firms also have high stakes in achieving success. For some companies, lack of success is not acceptable. So if you have a brick and mortar company that goes online, there may be reasons why the online business supports the traditional brick and mortar business. And for that reason, even if you struggle and maybe don't make a lot online, you just want to stay anyway. Well, that's going to lower potential profitability. That's going to raise rivalry. The last thing you want is a competitor who is selling products and willing to lose money for some reason other than profitability. And that's essentially what you have here. The final intensity of rivalry factor is high exit barriers. And what does it take to leave an industry? Ideally, you want unprofitable companies to bail out. But what if leaving an industry is costly? Think about a car manufacturer. Let's just say Ford wanted to go out of business tomorrow. If so, how much return would Ford get on the investment it has in the technology and the production plants and so forth? Very little. I mean, who is Ford going to find to buy all their plants and endure all of their obligations? You're not going to get 100 cents back on the dollar. So the exit barrier is high. What this means is that in Ford's situation, they're likely to stay around even if they have a few losing years. This is not good for the industry because for every other competitor trying to make a profit, you're having to compete with a company that is willing to stay in the business even when they're in a losing position, because it's actually better for them to lose year to year than it is for them to get out. Okay, so these 8 factors, if you go through one by one, give you a sense of the rivalry in an industry. Let's talk about threat of entry, or sometimes barriers to entry. Now, what's interesting about this is that barriers to entry occur naturally in an industry. Sometimes they're just structural factors or reasons why it's difficult for new competitors to come in. But sometimes existing companies erect these barriers. And I'll reference that as we go through this process, give you an example. Now, the first entry barrier is economies of scale. In other words, if the cost of production per unit goes down substantially as you produce a lot of product, then that's going to make it difficult for a new company to come in and compete unless that company can start by producing lots of products. And you think about automobiles as an example here. If I started my own company and produced 10 cars a year, my cost would be tremendous compared to an existing competitor like Nissan or Ford. So that economies of scale makes it difficult. It keeps prospective customers out. What about brand identity and product differentiation? If the buyers in an industry identify with the company they buy from, and if they perceive the products to be different, then that means they're going to be less likely to try a new product or new service if it comes in the industry. So if you have a lot of brand identity and product differentiation, it keeps potential customers out. Think about the market for buying bottled water. Now, I know some people say every brand is different and they claim to be able to taste multiple brands and tell which is which, but a lot of customers see branded water as just being water. And if that's the case, and I introduce a new water, they're going to be willing to try mine and maybe switch and use my brand. But on the other hand, if you think about soft drinks, a lot of Coke fans like Coke and don't like Pepsi, or Pepsi fans like Pepsi and don't like Coke. They identify with those brands. They perceive the market to be differentiated. When that's the case, then a new cola coming in is going to have a difficult time, because you're going to try to sell to customers that already have existing loyalties. What about capital requirements? This is a simple one. If it costs a lot to get into business, then you're not likely to have as many new companies coming in. So higher capital requirements, or higher entry costs rather, create capital requirements, and that will be a barrier to entry. What about switching costs? Now, if the switching costs are high in an industry, then what you have is new companies having to find a way to cover those switching costs. So if I'm going to provide cell phone service, and all of the customers already have 2-year commitments to Verizon or T-Mobile or another competitor, I've got to find a way to encourage customers to try my service. And in order to do so, I might have to buy out their contracts or give them a $300 bonus when they sign up. That's costly. That switching cost is going to keep new competitors out, because it's an additional cost of doing business. What about access to distribution channels? If new companies have the same access to distribution, maybe it's distributing a product directly to a customer or through warehouses or wholesalers, if they have that same access, that's fine. They're likely to come in. But if the access is controlled, if you have an existing company like Amazon that controls access because they have large contracts with the shipper, then that would keep new competitors or potentially new competitors from coming in. What about cost disadvantages independent of size? So the cost disadvantages that's related to size is economies of scale. In other words, large companies cut their costs because they produce lots of products. But sometimes there are advantages or disadvantages, you think about it both ways, that are not related to size but are related to other factors. So if a company has certain patents or specialized technology, other cost advantages, then those companies will keep new competitors out. Go back to the auto production example. Ford has lots of patents, has created a lot of expertise in terms of manufacturing cars. If I try to get into that business, I've got to learn all of that. So even though there's one issue in terms of me trying to produce lots of cars, there's another issue in terms of me just trying to do so in an efficient manner, because Ford just has that experience that I don't have. And finally, we can talk about government policy. Sometimes government policy just restricts new competitors. I can't start a hospital without passing government muster. There are different regulations in different industries. Sometimes these regulations don't just cover things like banks and medical services. Even being a hairstylist in many states, you have to pass a board exam and pay fees. So government policies can make it more difficult for competitors to come in the industry. Now, I did mention early on that companies often try to erect barriers to keep competitors out. Sometimes they do this by lobbying for regulations in an industry that will increase the cost that would be incurred by new competitors. Sometimes they create interesting programs or ways of doing it. For example, if you fly frequently, there are frequent flyer programs. You get so many miles every time you fly with Delta or American or your favorite airline. And what that does is it creates an incentive for you to stay with that airline, fly them again, so you get enough miles in order to get free flights or other goodies. So that's essentially creating a barrier to entry, because a new airline comes in. Well, now you have to sell tickets to people who have frequent flyer miles and other programs. So sometimes companies will take steps to try to raise these barriers, because they know that doing so can increase their profits. Now, the other three factors are pretty easy to explain. They're not a lot of details, but they're important nonetheless. The pressure from substitute products, again, come from sources outside the industry. So if you talk about competition, you're not talking about substitutes. So if you're talking about airline travel, let's say you talk about the airline industry and we define it that way. Well, using another means of transportation, say a car or a train, would be a substitute. The stronger the substitutes that are available, the lower the potential profits, because that means that customers can always switch and go outside of the industry to meet their needs. Now, what about the bargaining power of buyers and suppliers? We'll start with buyers and just point out a few examples here of when buyers have bargaining power. Again, high buyer bargaining power is not good for potential profitability. Let's just say the buyers are concentrated, or each one purchases a significant percentage of total industry sales. And use an extreme example. Let's say a half of what an industry puts out goes to a single buyer. Well, that buyer is going to wield a lot of power in that arrangement. You might say, well, that's really an extreme example. Well, in some cases, you have companies like Walmart that work with producers and they agree to buy all of their output. Well, if that happens, Walmart's going to have a lot of influence, even as a single company, over that supplier. So buyers, that buyer relationship can really be substantial in some cases. What if the products that the buyer purchased represent a significant percentage of the buyer's cost? If I'm buying paper clips and that's only peanuts in terms of what I spend as a company, then I don't care what they cost. I'm just going to buy them. But if I'm purchasing supplies or products that account for 20 or 30% of my costs, then I'm going to negotiate really hard and work one competitor against the other. So that can change buyer bargaining power. If the products are standard or undifferentiated, then I could just as easily purchase my products from one competitor versus another. Okay, what if the buyers face few switching costs? We talked about this earlier. Switching costs being the costs that are incurred when you switch from one company to another. If buyers face few switching costs, then that means they can very easily move back and forth among companies in the industry. If buyers earn low profits, creates pressure for them to reduce their purchasing costs, and they will then hammer the companies they do business with for lower prices. Sometimes buyers have the ability to become their own suppliers. Okay, this is called backward integration. So if a buyer can essentially create or produce its own supplies, then that's always a way to put pressure on existing suppliers. If the industry's product is relatively unimportant to the quality of the buyer's products or services, well, that means the buyer doesn't really care a whole lot. And if you don't really care about quality, or if quality is not important, you'll just buy from the cheapest producer. And finally, buyers have complete information. If buyers know everything about suppliers' costs, then they're going to use that information to their advantage and negotiate a better deal. Now, you can think about the same arrangement on the other side from suppliers. Now, sometimes the concept of buyers and suppliers can get complicated because a supplier from one perspective is a buyer from another perspective. So buyers are individuals that purchase the outputs of an industry. Suppliers are the companies that provide the input to the company. So the same issues pop up when you look from either side in terms of the power arrangement. For example, if the supplying industry is dominated or by only one or a few companies, then you're going to see the suppliers have a lot more bargaining power. If there aren't many substitutes available, then that means the suppliers control price because you have to have what they sell. If the buying industry is not a major customer of the suppliers, well, the suppliers then will have a lot of power because if you don't agree to their terms, they don't really care. You don't buy much from them. If the suppliers can become their own customers, we call this forward integration. This also is a check on the industries. So in other words, if I don't like selling my supplies to you, if I can just go around you, then perhaps I don't need you. And you can see this sometimes when manufacturers of products try to sell directly to consumers instead of going through retail outlets. It's a check on the retailers. And finally, if the supplier's products are differentiated or have built-in switching costs, that reduces the ability of buyers to play one supplier against the other. So we've talked about Porter's 5 forces model, and you think about the contribution of each force to potential profitability. It's a good place to start, but there are some limitations. First of all, this assumes we can provide a clear, recognizable industry definition. Sometimes that's difficult. So if we talk about fast food, and your definition of fast food might be different from mine, or maybe I'm talking about fast food in one country, perhaps the US, and you're talking about global fast food. These are different industry definitions, and as you have a different definition, then the analysis of the application of this model becomes different. It also assumes that large firms can't influence an industry structure. I gave you an example earlier of Walmart buying all of the output of a single company. In this particular instance, Walmart being so large, Walmart can influence the relationship as a single company. In most instances, we think about structure as not being influenced by one particular company, but sometimes that does happen. This assumes industry factors, not firm resources, are the primary profit drivers. This is an application of IO, or industrial organization. And it's also difficult to apply when firms operate in multiple countries. So if you're thinking about the industry for, say, McDonald's, you think about, again, are we talking about U.S. Industry or global industry? And the reason this makes a substantial difference is that customers purchase McDonald's goods for different reasons. And in the U.S., there's a heavy lunch business. Often it's for convenience, pick up a quick burger, go back to work, go on their way. In other countries, often people purchase McDonald's as a slice of Americana. It's a place you might go to eat in the evening for a different type of meal. And a sort of a simple way of thinking through this is think about Chinese food. If you're in China, you buy Chinese food all the time. That's what you eat. That's what people in China consume. Okay? But in the U.S., often we'll go out for Chinese, say on the weekend, or we might be more inclined to eat dinner at a Chinese restaurant. So when you think about a domestic industry versus a global industry, it can change all the factors. So how you define that industry specifically in terms of being across borders can have a lot to do with the application of the model. So this gets us to the third step of the case analysis process here. And here we apply Porter's 5 forces model in detail. Okay, you want to assess the specific factors in the industry rival and new entrant sections individually. So what this means, don't just say, okay, existing rivalry is high because of X and Y. You need to go through each of those 8 factors one by one, even if they're not relevant rather to your industry. You need to go through each one to provide a systematic analysis. Same thing is true when you talk about entry barriers. Look at all of the factors and walk through that and say, based on all of them, we can then draw a conclusion about the ease of entering an industry for new firms. We want to analyze the industry, not the firm. It's one of the things I can't overstate. If you get Google 5 forces analysis, you will see examples where individuals have applied Porter's 5 forces model to a company. That's not how it is really supposed to be used. Make sure you apply it to the industry. We get to specific company issues later. So when you think about your company, define the industry, apply the model to the entire industry. You want to make a judgment, a positive, negative, or neutral judgment about the effect of each force on the potential for profits. And then you want to blend all of those together into a summary that says, based on this detailed systematic analysis, this is either an industry with high potential profitability, maybe low, maybe somewhere in the middle. They often tend to be in the middle because the way industry structure works, you often have some positive and some negative factors, and they all blend together and sort of wash out sometimes in the middle. That's okay. If it's high or low or moderate, you still want to make that judgment, understand why the potential profitability is where it is. And this leads us to case analysis step number 4. And this is where we look at industry successes, failures, and critical success factors. So you recall at the beginning of the chapter, we talked about critical success factors, those things that most successful companies follow. You don't have to follow them and don't guarantee success, but their CSFs tend to be associated with success. And here you want to look at the history of an industry. What firms in the industry have succeeded and failed in the past? And use the examples of success or failure as support for CSFs. So you don't want to just pull things off the top of your head or just use a list that somebody posted. You want to provide examples. So companies that maybe went out of business can provide you an example of something that is a success factor because they didn't do it. Or maybe you might see the same company following 3 or 4 different practices that are all associated with success, maybe following 1 or 2 that aren't. This is not just about your company. This is about the entire industry. Okay, and you think about McDonald's, for example. Think about fast food as an industry. If you ever go in a fast food restaurant and you see those timers that keep track of the amount of time between it takes to fill an order, maybe a customer in the store, maybe a drive-through order, that's reinforcing the fact that quick service is a critical success factor. McDonald's has done really well in this. McDonald's scores very high in terms of getting people in and out of the restaurants. So using McDonald's as an example, you can support speed of service as a critical success factor. But you want to look at the history of the entire industry. You don't want to go back 1,000 years, but maybe 5-10 years developmentally, and learn from that history and use those historical examples as the basis for critical success factors in your industry. So this concludes our audio commentary for Chapter 2.